As the aviation industry spools up to embrace upset prevention and recovery training, there are both expected and unexpected outcomes. That's what we're going to talk about on our panel today. Welcome, everybody, to this great event we have going on today. We have a wonderful lineup of speakers. The presentation today, or the panel more accurately, is on upset training, unexpected outcomes, enhance aviation safety and proficiency. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. For the agenda today, we're going to be talking about a number of things. We're going to be addressing the introductions of the speakers themselves. Then we're going to be going to a very brief overview of upset prevention and recovery training. We had a great case study we're going to talk about with Delta Airlines in 5 years, 5 million flights, really great results. And then we're going to do a speaker round robin on our guest speakers here today to really get their thoughts on what they have found as trainers, practitioners, and users of upset prevention and recovery training, and what they found that helped, what they found were maybe limitations, what were things to be careful of when you seek out training for upset prevention and recovery training. So we'll go through that: expected outcomes, unexpected negatives, for example, and then we're going to go ahead and get to Q&A. Now, for today, if you want to download the slides from our presentation, maybe not now, but as you go through the event, that QR code, you can just scroll back to this time index of about 2 minutes and 30 seconds, and you can go ahead and get that QR code to download those slides. The URL is down there as well if you'd like to get that. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to bring our speakers in here. Going to be hopefully it's not an eye test too much. We had everybody along the bottom row there. Let me try the side, see if that's better. Let's go with the bottom row. Let's go ahead and get going here. And I'm just going to do the speakers one at a time. We're going to push through relatively quickly through the introductions to get to the conversation. So first up, we have Todd Baker. Todd is right. Let me just show you Todd here. Let me see if I can get him back on stage here. Todd is the chief pilot with Richardson Aviation. And Todd has a lot of experience, been there at 8 years, right, Todd, at Richardson, flying Gulfstreams, demo pilot, right, Global Aerospace, Marine Corps at Base Hawaii, I think was your last posting, where you're chief of staff and director of operation training, where you also flew Gulfstream. So welcome. Anything you want to say to the folks before we move on to Otter?
No, I just want to say hello to everybody. Thanks for joining us, and thanks to UBJ and APS for putting this together to discuss this important topic.
Thank you, Todd. First time speaker here at one of these events, so we love having you. Thank you so much. Next up, we have Clark McNeese, Captain Otter McNeese, and I'll be calling him Otter, so I might as well include Otter with his name. He's our Executive Vice President of Compliance and Standards at Aviation Performance Solutions. 10 years at a major air carrier before we plucked him away, but gosh, been at what, APS 18 years now, Otter, coming up on 19, is that right? Wow, fantastic. And he was a USN Navy fighter pilot as well, flying F-18s, and just a long-time pilot. I think he flew airplanes before he got a driver's license, right?
I did.
Anything you want to say to the folks before I move to Savio?
Oh, it's just great to be here, especially with these industry giants on this panel. So looking forward to the discussion.
Great. Next up, we have Captain Savio Schmitz. He's the Senior Examiner Standards Training Captain on the A380 at Emirates Airline. We were just talking before the event, 24 years there. So as I mentioned to him, a little long in the tooth at Emirates, but he's also a training captain on the A330, 340, experience on the Boeing 75, 767 ATRs. And believe it or not, I found on LinkedIn today a paratrooper in the German Federal Armed Forces. So I didn't expect that, Savio. So thanks for being here. Any initial comments for everybody out there?
No, thanks, BJ, for your intro, and for the APS team, especially Randy and Otter, for having me. Always a great learning experience with you guys. Thanks.
Wonderful. Well, great having you. Next up, we have Rich Stoll, Master CFI Emeritus there. Did I get that right? Master Instructor Emeritus. And Rich is really, I always talk about Rich in two ways. Either I talk to him about as a founder of UPRT or UPRT royalty, because when I think back over the history of the development of upset prevention and recovery training, which has had numerous names, I really think of three folks. I think of Rich Stoll, I think of Dave Carbo and Larry Rockcliffe, where general aviation led by Rich met with air carrier aviation led by Dave Carbo and Larry Rockcliffe. And I really think that was the founding, I believe, expertise that started this entire initiative of overcoming the threat of loss of control in flight. So it's just wonderful to have you here, Rich. An author of many, many books, emergency maneuver training, stall spin awareness. Anything you want to share with the folks before we move on to Jeff?
Thanks, BJ, for having me join again. It's always good to be here and spread this message. So looking forward to the conversation.
Awesome. Well, next up, somebody who needs no introduction for most of you out there is Captain Jeff Wofford. He was the former Director of Aviation Chief Pilot at CommScope. And yesterday we talked 38 years, Jeff. Wow. And so you flew King Airs and Learjets, is that right, primarily at CommScope?
Yeah, King Airs, Learjets, and then Challengers.
Okay, cool. That's awesome. And now you're on the PC-12 at Flying W Aviation, is that right?
That's correct, yep.
And then I knew you were in the Navy, but I didn't know you're a pilot rescue swimmer, so that's really cool. So, you know, it's what a diversity experience. In fact, just about everybody here on the call has military background.
Oh, yeah.
Anything you want to share with the folks? Actually, Jeff, I was the co-chairman when Jeff was chairman of the MBAA Safety Committee. So he was my mentor and still is. And so he threw the reins to me as he jumped off the ship and retired. So
Yeah, there you go.
For everything you do.
I appreciate being invited again. I always enjoy participating with these conferences, and so thanks for the invite and thank you for what you're doing.
We're excited about it. Hey, Baby Otter, before we move on to the next slide here, any thoughts on just kind of the general purpose of our event today? Like, how would you feel people watching at home? What is the goal of what we're talking about today?
Certainly the overall message is discussing value of UPRT, but probably maybe a little more focused would be some unexpected outcomes of it. So there's definitely an interest, I think, from everyone here. How can we use this in increasing safety there? And what do we need to do about it? Because probably most everybody on this panel agrees there needs to be some type of paradigm shift in the way we're training pilots currently.
Absolutely. And just as a reminder to folks out there, upset prevention recovery training, there's many different definitions of it, but really at the end of the day, it's a critical component to safety. And the key objective is really equipping pilots with the knowledge and skills to prevent and recover from airplane upsets. And I think, you know, a deficiency in this area is one of the main reasons why loss of control in flight has been established as the #1 threat to air safety. So, you know, what we find is that there is often a misconception, and understandably, that UPRT is designed about upset recovery. But in reality, the goal of an effective program is increased awareness, increased prevention, better flight envelope understanding, improved manual flight operation proficiency. So it's a really exciting implementation when it comes down to UPRT. Okay, great. I'm glad we got here. That took 3 minutes longer than I expected. We're at the case study. We have a really exciting case study we're going to start with, which was just announced late last year. Actually, no, early last year. We saw that at the UPRT Global Summit with Delta Airlines and APS, a 5-year, 5 million flight study by Delta Airlines in implementing powerful, effective UPRT in all of their fleet types. And just totally by coincidence, I promise you, is the program leader for the Delta UPRT program is Captain Brian Sims, and he's standing right over Otter's shoulder there. So Otter, why don't you guys take it from here for a chat? And I know that Savio and Jeff have a couple of questions.
Yeah, this is Captain Brian Sims, and like BJ said, he's the Delta UPRT program manager there, and has been now for
7 years.
7 years, yeah. And he was one of the line pilots, of course, involved when they introduced the APS methodologies into the airline back in 2015, I believe, and you were part of that, and then became a leader in it. And I think what's fascinating is this study that y'all were able to do that was over 5 years and 5 million flights, right? Is that correct? And so they came up with some fascinating insight into the increased safety, especially related to precursors. Would you mind just quickly, just briefly giving an overview of what you kind of found out?
Sure. So the particular area that we focus on when we're trying to determine what the precursor events are and what leads to an upset is we spend a lot of time looking at FOQA data. And so we have 3 sources of data when we're looking at this. We have ASAP data, which comes from the pilots. We have training data, which comes from our instructors. And then we have FOQA data, which comes from the aircraft itself. And so leading up to the UPRT summit earlier last year, we took a look at the last 5 years of data. And that was 5 million flights over 5 years. And the overall rate of upset precursor events was cut in half over that 5-year period.
Wow, that is so awesome. Very, very significant, especially when you consider 5 million flights. I don't want to hog the time here. Should we go right to questions, BJ?
Yeah, Savio, I think yesterday we chatted. I think you had a great question for Brian before we release him for his training, since we're kind of pulling him off the line here a little bit. Did you want to go ahead, Savio? Question for Brian?
Yeah, sure. First of all, I like to say congratulations to Brian and Delta and his team, for the effort and for the data derived. Actually, I have 3 questions for him, but I cut it really short. You mentioned already, Brian, that you use FOQA training data, so that would have been my first question. Do you use operational data, or you use operational and training data together? So you answered that question. What I would be interested in specifically, would you have an example of SPIs, safety performance indicators, that you particularly use, let's say, in training or in operations?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I mentioned the 3 sources of data being ASAP, training data, and FOQA data. And to be perfectly candid with you, there is a bit of a discrepancy between some of those data sources. So one example would be with the FOQA data, one of the things that we were able to determine was that a really significant number of the events occurred when the automation was disconnected. So anywhere from 67% up to 100% of the time on a fleet by fleet is where that range comes from, 67 to 100%, occurred when the automation was disconnected. And then when we looked at the training data, which was graded by the instructors, the grades were much higher. And so our training folks wanted to reduce the amount of time that we spent on manual flight training. But I pushed back on that and said, well, we have the aircraft data, which is from FOQA, and that's objective, right? The training data is subjective because it's an instructor's opinion. And then also the ASAP reports are somewhat subjective, and it's only as good as the information that is being provided to us. So we specifically, the data that I look at is the rate of exceedances, so the pitch, the bank, and the airspeed, and then any time that we're in either a stick shaker or an alpha floor. And I rely really heavily on that when we're looking at the data because it is so objective. And the ASAP helps color the picture when there's an event. We understand more background to what happened, but really the FOQA is where I spend my time looking because it is so objective. And I hope that answers the question.
Great. Thanks, Brian. If I may, hey, just one quick question. Do you, big picture-wise, do you see a difference between conventional aircraft and fly-by-wire aircraft?
Most of my experience has been on conventional aircraft. I'm thinking of 2 specific scenarios. So one of the things that's really interesting about the FOQA data is we can get very, very specific with the analysis. So on the Boeing side, the 767-300, that one aircraft type, accounted for more than 50% of the stick shaker events that we had. And those stick shaker events were predominantly between the flaps 1 and flaps up retraction phase, when the slats were retracting and the pilot was flying the aircraft manually. So that was a really high number of events that occurred there on the Boeing side. On the Airbus side, specifically the A320 fleet, the highest number of upsets that we had there was actually in the nose low phase of flight, and it was with the automation engaged. And so there was something that was causing the automation to chase the path in the nose down direction and exceeding 10 degrees nose down. And if you talk to the average line pilot, most of them have not seen that. And even with the instructors and line check airmen, they're pretty surprised when they hear that. But we have the FOCA data saying, hey, it has in fact happened. So yes, there is a difference between the fly-by-wire and the more conventional aircraft there in the data.
Cool. Thanks, Brian.
Awesome. Was it Jeff? You had a question?
It is. Oh,
Yeah,
yes, go ahead.
Yeah, good morning, Brian. I tell you, that really was a great case study, and it's some great information. My question for you is, what was the overall acceptance from the flight crews when they started doing UPRT? Was it they do it because it was mandated, or did they actually did they buy into it, and did they continue to be a believer in the training?
That's an excellent question. We had a lot of pushback early on. I myself was one of the skeptics early on. I would say across the board, that perspective and that position on the topic of UPRT changes when an instructor goes through UPRT on aircraft training. They come back with an entirely different perspective. And then the same is true when we put the pilots in the simulator. The effect of startle and surprise is really powerful. But most of the pilots, I mean, this isn't unique to Delta. Pilots are inherently fairly objective people. They want you to be able to prove things to them. We're not necessarily the most touchy-feely people out there. And so when we have a pilot come through training who is resistant or who is skeptical about it, we show them the data. And it is really, really eye-opening to them when they realize how often these precursor events are happening. You know, when you're talking about 5 million flights, the total number of upsets is very, very low. Mm-hmm. But even a small rate across 16,000 pilots and 5 million flights, you know, I'll let you do the math on it. But at one point, we were having one event per day, and that data is much better than it used to be. But when we started tracking it, we were at the rate of about one per day.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
Hey, Otter, I think you had a question for Brian, then we'll let him go.
Yeah, you have decided that for your UPRT SMEs, your primary UPRT simulator instructors that also train the rest of the other simulator instructors in the UPRT program, decided that it's still very important for them to actually come back every 2 years and fly in a real airplane and actually go through, shall we say, UPRT in a real airplane. Could you touch on just why you still think that is important?
Yeah, I think there's a couple reasons. One is just the instructor drift is a very real thing. And so I think it's important to get as close to the source document as possible, the source instructor, and you guys are the experts in that. So we come to you to be recalibrated. But if we don't continue to recalibrate, if we don't continue to check the checker, if you will, yesterday I had my biennial flight check with the FAA as an examiner, which I get every 2 years. And that check the checker event is very important, because if we are not very precise in what we're teaching, then the next level drifts, and then the next level drifts, and then the next level drifts. So that's really important that we don't allow that instructor drift to occur. The other, quite honestly, is just to continually be reminded of how powerful the startle effect is and the physiological effects of upset. Even now, I'm thinking about going out to fly here in just a couple hours and whether or not I'm going to hold my breakfast down and, you know, all the experiences that you get with. I was just very quickly, I'll share a story with you. I was flying last week with a gentleman in a private airplane. This was not at Delta. And we were out doing some air work. And he didn't tell me that he was going to put me into a spin. We were literally straight and level over the water. And he put me into a spin over the water in an airplane I had not flown in many years, in a seat I had not sat in many years. And the physiological sensation of that was very, very startling. And we came out of it and it was fine. But I was reminded once again how important it is to have a calibration and have a strategy before you get into an upset, because somewhere somebody is getting it every day.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Thanks for that. Well, thank you, Brian. Really appreciate you coming by. Great treat for us on the webinar for sure. Any other final quick questions or anything from the panel?
Thank you, Brian. Appreciate your time. Great to have you here.
See you guys.
Thanks. All right. See you in a little bit, Brian. I get to go fly with him here shortly myself. So
cool. Great. Okay. So I think we touched on most of the areas. The Focal ASAP data, 5 years, over 5 million flights. And the biggest one, of course, is a demonstrated 50% reduction in precursor airplane upset conditions. And so it was really exciting to see those results. AIN did a great article on it, but that QR code there, folks, if you want to go and listen to Brian with all the graphs and all the data and listen to him giving that event, you can go to that QR code. The URL is down there below that. And that's from last year's 2023 UPRT Global Summit. And he did a great job on safety risk management. Really, really well done. So let's go ahead now, guys. Well, one thing I was going to mention, Brian mentioned about instructor drift being a huge issue. I just connected with our director of marketing, Carrie, and she's going to include in that slide link an article. It's called the 5 main UPRT instructor drift challenges for UPRT instructors. So if you download those slides back at the 2-minute, 30-second mark, you're also going to get that article. It's a very popular one, but it's one of those unexpected ones as well. Very often you think that instructors won't drift in UPRT, but it's probably the most prevalent drifting that we've ever seen when it comes to instruction. Okay, let's go to our speaker messages, folks, and we're going to go through this a couple of 3 minutes for all the speakers. And Savia, why don't we go over to you, sir, with your great slides that you brought to the event and talk about your thoughts on UPRT outcomes, unexpected, expected. Over to you, sir.
Thanks, BJ. Yes, as you know, I'm a great supporter and passionate about UPRT and about the benefits of UPRT in improving pilots' performance and the competence. And competence means knowledge and skill, and the confidence. And so both together, the competence and the confidence means resilience. And that's not only during stall or upset recovery, but literally in everything they do on the aeroplane, every time they take the aeroplane in their hands. So I would say that UPRT skills are very transferable to normal operation and, of course, to abnormal operation, or as Boeing would say, non-normal operation. It's one thing which I personally find a little bit missing. So, and that's something you would have probably in the military, and that would what sports people have, and that's mental training and an aspect of applied psychology, if I may say. And if I can explain it a little bit, what you see on the slide there in this gray box on the right, it's a template. It's an upset recover template. This one is a no-slow, high-angle bank template, and how to recover from that. And you can split this template into 2 parts. There's an unexpected part, which relates to cognition, and there's an expected part, which is the abnormal part, the behavioral part, or the action items that we are supposed to apply in the upset recovery strategy. So in the first part, you find words like recognize and confirm the situation, and then you should make an announcement as to what the situation is. And you also should assess the status or the performance of the auto flight system. So I guess everyone would agree that recognizing, confirming, making an announcement, pulling something from the long-term memory into your prefrontal cortex, and likewise making an assessment, it's high cognitive effort, it's a high cognitive demand. And we need to get that cognition under control before we are able to access our action items. And we try to simplify those action items, which you see in a gray box, into push, hold, power, stabilize to make it simple. So if you click on my next slide, I can explain a little bit more what I mean. You see a couple of pictures there. You see on aeroplane training, you see simulator training, and then you see a real-life aeroplane. And the first graph underneath, which is labeled with a number 2, refers to the on-aeroplane training and the simulator training. So if we go for training, if we know normally as pilots that something is happening, or sometimes we even know what is happening. So the metaphorical, and I call it cognitive angle of attack, is very low in relation to the aerodynamic angle of attack of the aeroplane that we're going to practice in a simulator. So we have ample of space, cognitive margin, to recover the aeroplane fairly quickly and accurately. But now if we transfer that into the next graph under number 1, and let's assume we encounter a stall in real life with 100, 200, 300, 600 passengers on board unexpectedly, our cognitive angle of attack very, very quickly equals or exceeds the aerodynamic angle of attack. And psychologists would call that brain stall. I call it cognitive stall. And in order to go back to these action items, to be able to apply even these 4 words, push, hold, power, stabilize, we need to find a way to recover from the brain stall through a so-called cognitive gap into an area of some metacognition, which is on the left side from the stall, in order to show some effective cognitive control behavior. So in a nutshell, what I mean is we need to have a means to control our brain, our cognition, before we are able to effectively control the aerodynamic angle of attack in case of a stall, and thus the aeroplane. And that is something which I find greatly missing. I mean, even though the industry have recognized that fact, and we see CM courses and so on for the last 4 decades, 40 years or so, but in practical terms, I find that missing. And it's a little bit sad to see that even amateur tennis players and golfers and so on receive some form of mental training. But passengers, 600 passengers or whatever on an aeroplane of a 380 or a jumbo 747 type are not worth it.
Awesome. Thank you, Savio. That's excellent insights. I think I can see everybody nodding their head is like, that makes perfect sense. That's what we see. That's what we feel. And so thank you for sharing that. And just put a little break in here just for 1 second. Folks who are on the call, if you have any questions, it's a great idea to start posting them now. I'll keep track of them. We'll get to the speakers here in a little bit. We are going to take time for everybody to have a chat, but please go ahead and start posting your questions, and we'll come back to those. So up next, we have Jeff. Over to you, sir, for your thoughts on unexpected outcomes in UPRT.
All righty. So, as a lot of people know, I've been a big supporter and promoter of UPRT for a long time now. And over the years, I've taken opportunities, whether I was at recurrent training or doing a safety seminar or just sitting around a pilot lounge at the FBO to talk about UPRT to other pilots. And so typically I end up with 3 responses. The first one being, well, what do you do during UPRT training? What are you trying to do? And I'll explain that. And then another one is, well, how can I sell this idea to my boss? How do I get funding to do the additional training? And I try to help with that. The third one, and this is one of the things I want to focus on today, is I get this response is, well, I don't think I need this. I've been flying for a long time. If something happens, I know what to do. Or the next best thing is, well, I've read about it or I've watched a video. And so that's really what I want to talk about. And so I'm going to take a little parallel track here. So in 1972, I was 15 years old, and this is when all the Kung Fu movies started coming out. And as a typical 15-year-old, I was fascinated by this whole thing and decided that I wanted to learn how to do Kung Fu. So I did some research. I was living in Dalton, Georgia. The closest place was in Chattanooga, so it was about a 30-minute drive. And my mom didn't want to do it. So I had a quandary until I turned 16. So I did the next best thing. I went to the bookstore and I bought Bruce Tegner's Learn Kung Fu book. And there's a big book, a lot of pictures, a lot of explanations. And so I spent the next, it's almost a year trying to teach myself Kung Fu. Well, I turned 16, get my driver's license, and one of the first trips I made was up to Chattanooga to the Kung Fu school, and went in and checked in and got signed up. And so the first thing the black belt did was interview me. And he says, well, Mr. Wofford, he said, do you have any experience in martial arts? And I said, yes, sir, I do. I've been training for a year. And he said, well, great. He said, rather than put you in the beginner's class, we're going to put you in the advanced junior class, and I think that'll be good for you. So that's what we did. And so later that day, I go into the class, and they asked me to do a kata. And it was a fairly simple one, consisted about like 35 or 40 different moves. And I botched it something fierce. I mean, it's one thing to practice when somebody's teaching you, but to try to do it from pictures in a book, you just don't see the fine points. So I did a terrible job. And so they asked me to sit down. And of course, there was typical snickering in the room. Well, a little while later, I had to get out on the mat and get with a sparring partner. And long story short, I got whipped pretty good. At the end of the session, the black belt walked up to him and he says, "Well, Mr. Wofford," he said, "I don't mean to question it, but you said you'd been training for over a year." He said, "Can I ask you where you were training?" And I said, "Oh, I bought Bruce Tegner's book." He goes, that explains it." He said, "There are certain things that you can't read or you can't get from a book." And he said, "So I'm going to put you back in the beginner's class and let's just start over." And so while this may be a little bit of a weird track for us talking about UPRT, the point I'm trying to make is that, you know, there are many things that require a specific skill set, and you can't get this from reading a book or watching a video or listening to somebody. You've got to experience it. And I think this is especially true with UPRT. And I don't believe anything can replace a formal on-wing UPRT program. You're exposed to the G-forces, the visuals, and everything else that helps you build this resource in your toolkit to make you a better pilot. And I think the other thing, there's two other points I wanted to make is, and Brian even hinted to this, is UPRT does require a knowledgeable instructor. You can't just go up with anybody and do aerobatics and expect to get true UPRT training. You've got to have a program, you've got to have qualified instructors, and you need to do your homework or you're going to pick somebody. And I guess the last thing I wanted to point out is over the last 20 years or so, we've really been focusing on technology in the airplanes. We've been looking at automation and avionics, and we're paying the price for that. And so I think that UPRT is a great way to go back and refocus on manual handling skills. And so basically that's my Kung Fu story and how we need to do this for real rather than read it from a book.
Cool. Thanks, Jeff. So I guess my question for you would be, so is the unexpected outcome for those who said they don't need it, do they come back and say, my gosh, yes, I did? Or what's the general sense you get from those people that were trying to talk you out of having to go?
Yeah, the ones that actually ended up going, and I've had some interesting conversations when I was at Flight Safety. I was on the same recurrent schedule with quite a few of them, and several had gone out and done UPRT, and it was funny when we got back together, you know, like a year later. They go, "Oh, you were right. We really needed to do this." And you know, I think the naysayers is the ones we read about in the news. You know, I think one of the bad things is that when you find out you need it is almost too late. So, but no, I think once people start looking at it, and I've even talked the training providers into taking the simulators off motion and doing it as sort of an additional training, you know, sort of expanding on unusual attitude recovery. And when people see what you have to do to be able to get the airplane out of an upset, it does wake them up a little bit. And so it's been some interesting reports afterwards.
Great. Thank you, Jeff. Rich, over to you, sir, for your thoughts on unexpected outcomes.
Yes, thanks. And yeah, I'm going to play off of what Jeff and Savio both touched on. There seem to be three different groups of people out there, right? There are the people who want additional training and will come and take UPRT, and by and large, they go away as enthusiastic disciples of the training. Then you have the group that's on the fence that could be convinced one way or the other, and then you have the group that will probably never reach. And it's kind of interesting to see that disparity because as trainers, as instructors, we usually deal with pilots who are interested in continuing education and learning more and more and more. So that's kind of an interesting differential. I think one of the unexpected things. So when I started back in '87, right, I'm fairly new in the aviation game and everything else. I was thinking, well, it was all going to be about the mechanics of flying the airplane. But as Savio mentioned, and I like his phraseology there, the brain stall. A lot of what we do as UPRT instructors is really the mental training part of it, right? Because if their mind isn't in the right place, if they don't have the mindset to handle the UPRT, then the physical part is not going to really work. So oftentimes I tell people when I'm training that a lot of what we have to do is we have to keep the brain in charge of the body, because if there's a disconnect, the body's going to do all the wrong things. So that was one of the unexpected things that we have to play as much psychologist as anything else and really work on mindset. The other unexpected part, it's good now, but the unexpected part is that it's taken so long to get to this point. The Delta study is fantastic and amazing, but we can go back almost 50 years, 48 years to be more exact, to the General Aviation Stall Awareness Study that said that enhanced stall awareness training, including spin training, can reduce the number of accidental spins after stalls. And so 50 years later, we're still trying to convince people that there is a good way to go about doing this. And so I think part of what we need to do, what we do is try to show people and convince people that proficiency training, ongoing training, is normal and necessary. And so I'll leave it at that because I know time is short and we can move on.
Excellent. Any questions for Rich, guys? Nicely said, Rich. All right, Todd, over to you, sir. Your thoughts.
Yeah, I think great conversations. I tell you, it's interesting we have a smaller flight department here compared to Savio and Brian, and the way they implement this on scale is kind of makes my head spin a little bit on considerations that I never thought of. So it was very interesting to listen to that. I'll go back to Savio's discussion on very psychological and scientific and way above my pay grade as a Marine. Things were beaten into me. At an early age, I had an instructor tell me that there is no airspeed in aviation. There is only angle of attack. And that stuck with me for a very long time since into my civilian career. Here at Richardson, we've been dabbling in for about a decade in UPRT training, but it was optional and it was really just the initial course. And it's only in the last 4 years where we've kind of taken that next step where we've fully encompassed our relationship with APS and our UPRT system and fully implemented into or integrated into our culture here. We're firm believers in doing it routinely. Growing up, I learned that I think he called it the brain stall is how Savio talked about it. We used to call it operating on stem power in the military when everything goes crazy and you just revert right back down to your training. And that training it cannot be just done once or twice. It has to be done routinely. It has to be integrated firmly into your culture. So every 2 years, getting on aircraft training to where you can learn those transferable skills, because everybody here flies two types, and so you need to be able to adjust from which airplane you're flying. Well, those skills are all transferable that you learn with the Marchetti out there at low altitude, at high altitude. You get to feel the G's, you get to feel the seat of the pants feel, and you get to actually look at it and learn it. And I think that imprints it on the mind. But then that's only every 2 years. And then after that, in the cycles, we do simulator stuff where we get into our airplane and we practice all of the same routines with a qualified instructor in an environment that we're going to be operating. That if we do see something like this, that's where we're going to see it. And then the final step on that is to do the online modules. And the way I look at that is that just keeps the concepts and the ideas fresh in your mind to where everybody is always thinking about it. And through that repetition and through that training program, I think, at least I hope, and Savio will correct me if it's not, will lend to being able to transition that between your cognitive and your actual angle of attack there that he was talking about. I'll tell you that just real quickly, the unexpected that I didn't expect after we implemented. There's a lot of the obvious stuff that you would know would come from a program like this and implementing it, but the unexpected stuff that I've seen from talking to the pilots here at Richardson is that the skill sets that have been learned there in energy management, in recognition of how to control the airplane and all those different phases of flight has permeated all the phases from the initial rotation at takeoff to the flare at landing. There's an awareness out there now that really, I think, far more emphasizes the P part in UPRT than I would have initially, maybe 4 years ago, would have assessed. So it's been great for our program. It's given confidence and situational awareness to all of our pilots, and I think every one of them would say that it's been training well worth it.
Great. Thank you, Todd. A lot of great insights there. And, one of the things that's often counterintuitive is how, while people want to focus on awareness and prevention, that is absolutely the primary mitigation, right? The best recovery is never being there in the first place. That said, that upset recovery training, building that mental model of the escalation of events, recognizing, developing situations early, being able to diagnose situations, is really all about improving awareness prevention. So it's kind of a circular connection between the process of awareness, the academic training, the prevention training, recovery, and escalating and mitigating that process of de-escalating events. So well said. So Otter, I'm going to transition you to maybe tie a few things together here before we move on to slides and questions.
It's great to hear all of these comments from these industry leaders. I would like to say some of them are surprising, but they're at my journey in this over the last 2 decades of actually teaching, and I can completely relate to everything they're saying and validate as well. Is certainly when I started doing this as a former general aviation and fighter guy and airline pilot, I never would have believed this would have been of any significant value for pilots. But it's really neat to see their validation of it, and especially as it relates, as Todd just said, there is a transcendent value that expands just beyond the upset arena that affects a pilot's mental modeling, his manual flight operations handling skills and confidence and competence that just goes up. Every area of the flight is affected better because of that UPRT that he's had. So I never would have thought about it that way until I had seen it myself in former customers that I trained.
Well, guys, I know we have some slides coming up, and we only have a couple questions. I'm going to put one question in front of us now, and then as we're waiting for more, we'll step through the remaining slides. This is a great one by Pete Redden. So, Pete, I'm going to bring your question up here. Very good question. We talked about the importance of an instructor in UPRT. And boy, negative transfer of skill, negative training, instructor drift. My goodness, Brian at Delta Airlines talking about the qualification process they go through with their subject matter experts, their instructor evaluators, line instructors. Gosh, the instructor is really the hallmark of an effective program. Even Otter in our Every Pilot in Control Solution Standard, it is the #1 element. So why don't we put that to the group? What does constitute qualified instructor? So I'm going to go to you, Otter, to facilitate this conversation.
Okay. Well, let me just, I'll pass at this point right to Savio, because he and I have worked together in this area for a good number of years now. And how should this play out? How do we help get airline pilots, even current airline pilots, as well as future airline pilots, the best training possible? He would agree an instructor is the key. Savio, what are your thoughts on the qualifications needed?
I think it's the mix, it's the entire person. You can't say, hey, he needs to have a background in UPRT, in flying fighters or in aerobatics or whatever. Certainly that would help. But what's true for every pilot, and that means having the competence, primarily the knowledge and skill, and having exhaustive understanding, which is probably even more important than the knowledge of principles of flights, at aerodynamics and so on, is important. But then the human side as well, as psychological expertise is too much, but kind of an insight in those things as well, a little bit of empathy. And I need to be very careful when I say that, because you don't want to have many psychologists in the simulator or on the aeroplane. That would be very dangerous. That's not what I mean, but you would need someone who has an understanding of what is going on between the ears in the mind when people are highly stressed, and translate this and go into the pilot's head and elaborate that while they experience exercises or scenarios in the simulator or in the aeroplane. And it needs to be done timely. There's no point in discussing something 6 months prior to an event or 3 months after an event. It needs to be timely. And so, there is a lot of experience required on a technical side, but as well on the human side, on the human aspect as well.
Yeah. I like talking to Savio about this because of his human factors bent, and which is really what UPRT is all about. You're actually doing some studies now in human factors, aren't you?
No, I'm studying occupational psychology, which includes some human factors. But
and you're married to someone who's a human factors expert, aren't you?
Yeah, doctor in psychology. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Hey, Rich, you've had to train instructors for your operation because you've had a emergency maneuver and upset training program for a lot of years now, and you've had to bring instructors online. Do you want to talk about that process?
Sure. And first, shout out to Pete. He and I did a podcast just a couple of weeks ago. I think it dropped. Good to see you on here, Pete. And also, BJ, maybe you want to make that paper available that we put together a long time ago. That was one of the pieces of that. One of the things I'll say is that all of the UPRT instructors, EMT instructors I've trained have come in to take the training with a growth mindset, and then they begged, I think is probably a better word, what they need to do to stay and teach that. And so we've been pretty lucky from that standpoint. And so I would say, first of all, it's a growth mindset, right? It's not somebody who says, well, I'm already an aerobatic pilot. And you would think that that's a natural fit already, but totally different domains between teaching someone how to do an aerobatic maneuver correctly versus putting pilots through unusual attitudes and having them fix errors, fix mistakes. And so my experience, at least, has been the right type of personality has tended to seek me out. So I don't know that that's a small sample size, and it's a kind of a unique subset group, but I think that's really what you want to find. You want to find people who are passionate about safety and who want to learn more and really want to pass that on. So I think maybe we all can agree on this, that the best instructors are also the best students.
Awesome.
Can I just jump in real quick for 1 second, if you don't mind? So I think that, one of the things we always find is the great news about UPRT instructors is they all have the best of intentions. They all want to try to improve safety. They want to do the best that they can, but sometimes that's where the instructor drift element comes in, right? They're not picking from a source of resources of expertise that is validated and verified. There's a lot of great information now out in the industry that can help guide instructors. And I know that instructors, when they come to APS, very often they're former fighter pilots, they're either former airline pilots as well, or corporate executive pilots. And so one of the challenges we have, to Rich's point, is they feel like they're already qualified. And so when they arrive, one of the conversation Otter probably has to have in the first day or two is going to be, here's your 1-year mission, whether you choose to accept it, is you need to do it our way for 1 year and to teach it exactly the way we do and take notes. And at the end of 1 year, we'll get feedback. Now, that said, that it is not as our way or the highway as that, but certainly any safety issues that they have, they can always give feedback. But the point is very often the methods used in effective UPRT are not necessarily intuitive. There's a reason why there's a sequence of events put in a certain order to teach instructors how to become effective instructors. And I think what Rich and Savio both talked about, a big part of that job is the instructor is a psychologist. They have, much like a salesperson, they have to adapt themselves to the student. They have to help teach the student in the way that student learns. And we often talk about, especially when we're certifying an airline, is at whatever level they start, we can take you up 3 floors. So if you come in at level 4, we can take you to 7. You come in at 2, we can take you to 5. And so the idea behind it is just be sure whatever is being taught is correct, it's positively transferable, it's not negative training, and that it's going to be effective across fleet types as they leave the program. An instructor really needs to understand transferability. So back to you, Otter, on that.
You know, it is a very important point about transferability because, as Rich knows, well, in the industry, when we were teaching upset training early on, there were some inappropriate techniques taught. And they did lead to accidents there, and the industry stakeholders at large internationally are very concerned about what's being taught. And as BJ has said for many years too, it would be better for us to do nothing than to do it wrong. There's certainly some major consequences there. I noticed we've got some head of training on the webinar here joining us, things like that. And I'm sure some of their questions are like, well, okay, well, where can we go? What can we do? How do we know that we are going to be able to implement a UPRT program? Savio, you have some thoughts for, say, a large flight department? Where could a head of training, what should he be thinking about? Should he be thinking, let me find somebody internally to help develop my program, or should he go outside of the airline?
It depends on where you find the expertise. If you find the expertise internally, that could be valid. If you don't find the expertise outside, you would probably go outside, or you find you seek for support from outside. Difficult to say. It depends on the situation, I would say. If I may add something, it's when I make speeches there about cognitive angle of attack and all those things, whatever we do, we need to be very careful with those statements, because back to BJ's instructor drift and standardization drift, if there's so much room for interpretation and get it wrong, so what I would like to see in the industry as well, kind of a concerted effort between academics and practitioners. It cannot only be practitioners and say, oh, this is the right way to do this, how the human behaves under extreme stress. And when I say and focus on this extreme stress, I know UPRT has 2 parts, the prevention and the recovery part, but provocably, I say that airplanes are not lost in prevention, they're lost in recovery. And when we zoom in on this recovery part, that's where the high stress is, and there where the airplane is lost because of the brain stall. And that's where I think we need to zoom in ultimately. Of course, prevention is the primary thing we want to do. But we need to be very careful, not only look at the practitioner side, but also back it up with some proven scientific evidence as well.
Could I maybe ask, that's great, Savio. Could I maybe ask Todd and Jeff what they look for in an instructor for their flight department. You guys as chief pilots, directors of aviation, you really have to care for your pilots to be sure they're getting transferable, effective training that's going to map into your safety culture, your methods, your processes. So why don't we start maybe with Todd, then end with Jeff on that. Then we have one more question, guys, before we wrap up today. Yeah, sure, BJ. I think that the consistency is the key for us. When we go through the training, we want to have the same message being given with the same answers to the same questions, because that is what, in that 2 days that we're out there, or in the 2 hours we're in the sim, that's when that's getting honed in. But that has to last. And if you start having different techniques or different opinions being given from one to the other, that causes a stress gradient inside the cockpit with flight crews that maybe have heard two different things. So consistency, I think, is key with that. The psychological discussions are obviously very important. For me, it's an instructor who obviously understands the material, knows it full, and is passionate about it, which then makes it easy for them to then discuss that. And I think Otter mentioned he's got to be able to, or BJ, maybe it was you that mentioned, the instructor has to be able to talk to the specific students in front of them. But more importantly, they have to be able to talk to that student in the moment and determine what it is that makes them tick, what kind of student that is. And that's a very difficult thing, which I don't understand. I'm not a UPRT instructor. But that is something that I've seen, is everybody's different, and the instructor has to move from student to student to make sure they're getting through. Jeff?
Yeah, so I agree with what Todd was saying. But, like when we got ready to implement UPRT in our department, I did a lot of research. I looked at, different providers, and in the late 2000s, there were several companies providing UPRT, and one of them was NTPS, and then there was a couple other providers that were doing everything from mock air combat training and aerobatics and UPRT all rolled into one. And I'm suspicious of those companies. And so what I ended up settling on was a very professional company that had highly qualified instructors and had an organized program, and they focused on UPRT. And so the more I looked into it, the more I figured they would be a good fit. And so I took myself and one of my other pilots out to do our first event. And I promised this company I wouldn't brag on them while I was doing this. But anyway, we went out, and it was a very professional group of people that put this material together. And I think, like I mentioned earlier, UPRT is a unique skill set, and you can't just take an instructor, a regular sim instructor at CAE or flight safety that hasn't been trained on UPRT and expect a good outcome. And so do your homework, go to a place that's got a good program and make sure they've got the capabilities. And I think that there's a lot of potential out there. One of my pet peeves is we've got simulators that we could do UPRT in. The FAA says they're not certified, but yet, we can still let people see what's going on. But the key here is to make sure that you've got people that are familiar with the principles behind UPRT and understand how to teach it. Otherwise, you're just going to have some negative outcomes.
Thank you, Jeff. Guys, of course, right in the last 2 minutes, a bunch of questions come rolling in. So I know we're coming to the top of our time. Speakers, if you guys need to go, please feel free to exit. I think I'd like to go ahead and try to answer these remaining 4 questions if it's okay. So I think as a minimum, Otter, you and I can stay for another 10 minutes or so and address that. You guys are welcome to stay. But, thank you, everybody here, for being on the call and bringing your expertise. Again, as practitioners, instructors, and users, it really gives a unique perspective to the industry. So let me talk to this one a little bit, because it's really, in fact, I'm going to put this over to you, Otter. This is a great question for somebody wanting to implement full flight simulator, UPRT, and the effectiveness of academics being a mitigation of impact. Over to you to kind of field this one, Otter. I was extending the discussion to let you read it. Go ahead.
Okay. It looks like he's wondering about how to achieve high quality program in a flight simulator that's not really certified for it. And that absolutely is very possible to do as long as the instructor is appropriately trained, because it is important that the instructor know what part of the flight envelope is valid and what's not there. And but in large degree, the current level C, level D simulators that are available to most professional pilots in flight departments and airlines, things like that, can be used very, very well and in a robust way to help train some skill sets and knowledge sets for pilots. There. Now, I will just say that the simulator really is only one part of a complete robust program, because you're still missing the reality factor in a simulator, still missing some of the psychophysiological aspects of real upsets that you just simply cannot get in a simulator. So, and let's see the other question: could a strong academic program solve a training scenario deficiency? I'm not sure I understand the question. Anybody want to speak to that?
The way I read it is there. My answer to that would be no. Is that if you're trying to accomplish everything that we're talking about with just an academic program, then I think you're largely doing yourself a disservice for a lot of the reasons we've talked here. The book knowledge, to go back to the Kung Fu lesson, you can learn all those things from the book, but when you get out on the mat, it's a whole different world.
Exactly.
In my opinion, whenever you do training, whether it's on aeroplane or in a simulator, there's always an element of psychological safety. And this psychological safety is simply diminished, or it's not there when you're in a real life event. Now, we always talk about integrated approaches, and so integrated approaches to me means to have the knowledge understanding. So obviously the academic component, the applicable academic component, and that takes the human factors aspect into account as well, is important as a foundation. And then comes the application, and it takes a very, very long time to design those scenarios very carefully. I'm not talking about the exercise, I'm talking about scenarios. It takes a very, very long time to draft them carefully. And it takes a very, very skillful instructor to extract the real meat from those scenarios, from those exercises. And so that takes a lot of effort to do that. So one component alone doesn't do it. It needs to be a holistic approach. It needs to be an integrated program.
So the only thing I would add there, Otter, is for this particular person, unfortunately, the name didn't come through, is the Airplane Upset Recovery Training Aid Revision 2 in Section 2 talks about how to assess the simulator to be able to effectively used in UPRT. Of course, it's related to the validated training envelope, experience of the instructor, all the stuff you've talked about here today. But do keep in mind there's a revision 3 out there as well, which has great information on prevention. So I think that was well covered, guys. Let's go to the next one. So the question here is on recency of UPRT. You know, maybe we could start with Todd on that, because he has a flight department, and Jeff, you know, I know that flight departments at APS, because we train many thousands of pilots, is that very often civilian flight departments kind of self-select every 2 to 3 years for recurrent training. Military, believe it or not, comes back every year. You'd think it might be a little bit different, but it kind of really depends, I believe, on budget management, availability, training schedule, but I think also the atrophy of skill. So Todd, you obviously, and Jeff, you guys made decisions on that. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, about what recency of experience is related to this question at all, and how you would approach it?
Yeah, we when we approached it to coming up with the comprehensive program, we looked at doing an annual thing too. And I think the ideal is that's what you would do is go back and do an annual recurrent. Obviously, the budget considerations enter into that conversation. But what was important for us, even though we couldn't do it annually on aircraft, was to implement the simulator portion of that. So we do an event every year, and so we're going through the motions, and we're going through the ground school and the academics, and then we're going through the execution. So it's always on the forefront of the mind, and that was what was important with us. So it's obviously a budget question. The more you do it, the better you're going to be. That's just, the more you train, the quicker that's going to come back. I will say it's been a long time since they did stall and spin training. We talked about it a little bit earlier, but that is very true. That I think that there's a hole in the pilot training, generally speaking. And even if you did the stall and spin training initially, because there's some stories out there where they've never seen it. So I think the knowledge of knowing that there's a hole there that needs to be filled is a large part of the battle.
Sorry, maybe before I go to you. Hey, Jeff, maybe before I go to you, since this is right in the heart of Rich's expertise, maybe, Rich, do you want to comment and then have Jeff wrap it up?
Sure. So, some of the different agencies we've worked with, if it's a new hire's initial, it'll be every 2-year requirement for upset training, and then a 3-year cycle. And that seems to work pretty well given their expertise. But we should probably do an entire show, an entire program on the state of CFI expertise relating to stall spin and law of primacy, and we need to do a much better job there, starting from day one.
Jeff, thank you, Rich.
Yeah, so I agree with Rich 100% there, and with Todd as well. Law of primacy is essential. I mean, the stuff we do recently, we're going to be better at. The FAA says we have to do 3 takeoff and landings within 90 days. There's a reason for that. The same thing applies to any other special skill set. We're supposed to have so much instrument training, so many approaches, and and so much instrument time within 6 months. So obviously, it requires recency of training. And then, like Rich said, I think we could do a whole webinar on the lack of standardization and the lack of training available now. We've got a big deficiency right now in stall spin awareness. If you don't get your CFI, if you follow a route which gets you to a professional pilot without being a flight instructor, you don't do spins. And I've been with some people that did that, and I mean, it's really we have something lacking. And then even the other thing is, right now with some of the instructors we've got, they're not competent or qualified to really be teaching spins, and so they'll go up on a DA-20 and do an incipient spin and recover before you actually get into the spin. And while that's beneficial, you're not really getting the true experience of what a spin looks like. And so I think we really need to go back, and like I said, this is a question or a subject for a much longer event, to talk about the need for revamping our training requirements and going back to focusing on manual handling skills, and things like that. But yeah, it's you've got to go back and do recurrency. And we ended up settling on, every other year.
Thank you, Jeff, Todd, Rich. Great. Here's a really good question. I want to make sure we get to this one on negative training. So negative training is a concern. This is from Mauricio. According to your experiences, what specific examples of negative training have you had, and how these have or could have ended in incidents or accidents? And I think Otter earlier mentioned negative training. American 587 is a great example of the wake encounter out of New York, and then inappropriate using rudder to try to mitigate roll, and getting into the PIO, the cyclic stresses on the tail, is just one example. And so maybe, Otter, over to you to facilitate this with the group.
Yeah, man, wow, I could talk about this a long time. I'm not going to do that. But let's jump. Let me start with Savio, because I know he's certainly concerned with it at the airline.
Yeah, probably even at industry level, when the recognition came that, stall is about angle of attack recovery, rather than losing altitude and so on. And with it came changes like to apply the thrust smoothly, or power in a propeller aeroplane. There's a certain danger when you practice high altitude stalls and where there's ample of space available to recover, And then, you focus on angle of attack recovery. And now you translate or you transfer to low altitude recoveries, and people apply, or pilots apply, the same technique that they apply at high altitude, they apply at low altitude. So you might find that they apply the thrust very slowly, which is not very beneficial, I would say, when you're at low altitude, because obviously thrust available is much higher at low altitude than at high altitude, and you need to use it to fly away from the ground. So there is, if that not emphasize the difference between a high altitude stall and a low altitude stall, there is some space for negative training or negative transfer of training even.
And Rich, is it fair to say the biggest demographic that you have in your business of training pilots, in general, these customers are going on to fly their smaller airplane, whether it's single engine or twin engine type of airplane? Is that correct?
Yeah, so mostly helping general aviation pilots feel more comfortable, competent, safer when they go back into their own equipment. But talking about this negative transfer in the training environment itself, making UPRT training itself potentially dangerous. We read about this at least once every year, every couple of years. There was one fairly recently down in Australia where a flight instructor was applying a specialized spin recovery technique that works in a specific type of high performance aircraft to something else, and resulted in a spin training accident. So again, just, the instructor applying wrong techniques to the wrong airplane, resulting in an accident in an environment where we're trying to learn how not to have these accidents.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a great example, especially in the on-aircraft UPRT training environment. I will mention one, say, from the simulator UPRT environment, how again, tremendous risk of negative training there as well. The simple act of unloading, for instance, teaching pilots how to reduce angle of attack. If the instructor is not very aware of the actual control input they're making and how aggressive they are, they can literally learn too aggressively, and it is definitely led to incidents. It was 757 where the FO was at top of descent in real airplane, and his airspeed indication dropped 80 knots. He thought he needed to unload. Well, he did all right. Way over pushed, went to negative G's, hurt a bunch of people in the back. But I don't fault him, because I guarantee you the way he moved that control yoke in unloading was exactly like he'd been done in the simulator for hundreds of times before, but he never had a sim instructor tell him that's not the way you can do it. So
That's a great point, Otter, is that very often people think about G loading as part of the training, that it's not really the positive G, it's the proper unload that is really the hallmark and the key to effective upset prevention and recovery training. So guys, I'm going to end it there. I think that's a great set of questions. We're now approaching 15 minutes past the planned time. So thank you all for sticking around. So to each of our speakers, thanks each of you for being here, bringing your expertise to share openly. We appreciate that. But most importantly, I'd like to thank all the folks that are online at this event, and the many thousands of people that are going to watch this on demand. So with that, everybody, thank you very much. Appreciate your time today, guys, and we'll see you at the next event. Take care.
Thank you.